What's up, my Canadian cousins? How are we today? I'm well. I hope you are too. Today we're going to go back to history and look at why it took Newfoundland and Labrador so long to join Confederation. I like to give, sort of my baseline knowledge on these things going into them so you get a sense of where I'm at. I've known for probably most of my life as I've been studying history that Newfoundland was not part of Canada until I think it was the late 1940s, maybe 1949. I'm not quite sure if Newfoundland and Labrador were separate colonies or they were always part of one colony. One of the things I have been aware of in studying American history and World War II very well is that in order for President Roosevelt to get around America's laws of neutrality early on in the war that supplied aid to the Allies, there was a program of destroyers for bases, and it was an exchange of American destroyers to go to Great Britain in exchange for leases of bases all over the place, and one in particular was in Newfoundland, and I did know that. But I don't know why they didn't originally join Confederation when it first formed in 1867, if I'm not mistaken. Why it took so long, and ultimately what were the considerations for it happening. I did hear, although I don't really know very many details, is that possibly there was consideration for Newfoundland at one point to join the United States, but probably nothing very serious or nothing that ever gained serious traction. But that's very interesting to me. In any case, we're going to check it out now, my friends, so you know how little I know about it as my baseline. And so I think I'm going to be learning quite a lot today. All right, my friends, I will see you on the flip side.
Canada folded together around the same time, except for Newfoundland, who joined 85 years later. I'm going to try to be fair on this because there are still people alive who are citizens of an independent Newfoundland. In the first, Newfoundland is an island, and also attached to Canada. This area is called Newfoundland. This island is called Newfoundland. This landmass over here is called Labrador. It's part of Newfoundland, the country, not the island. In 1809, Labrador was sectioned off from the province of Canada and given to the colony of Newfoundland. Until the 1940s, this part of the country was just where the Montana and Naskapi Inuit lived. After this point, it became a mining colony of Newfoundland. The island, not the country. In 1864, Newfoundland sent 2 men to a delegation for the formation of Canada. However, mass movement against Confederation in Newfoundland rose, and in 1869 a new government was formed, forever isolating Newfoundland from the new country of Canada. Newfoundland instead asks to become a separate and independent country from England, and with that, the Dominion of Newfoundland lives side by side with the Dominion of Canada.
Oh, okay. I was going to pause and ask the question before, but I guess he just answered it. He was referring to Newfoundland as a country, with the island of Newfoundland and the land mass or the borders, what made up Labrador, as one country of Newfoundland, and I was kind of confused by it because I thought it was still just a British colony at that point, but now he's saying how it became its own separate dominion, which I assume probably had similar status vis-a-vis the mother country, Britain, that the Dominion of Canada did at this time, politically.
Newfoundland was a young and blossoming republic with a vast amount of wealth from its sea trade. However, during the Great Depression, Newfoundland had amounted $40 million in debt, and neither Canada.
So before they get into this debt issue, which is interesting, and I assume maybe leads to why they needed to be part of a larger group, but he called it a republic, and I'm curious about that because I guess it depends on how you look at it, right? I don't know what the government of Newfoundland was like, but if it was like the government of Canada, which is a constitutional monarchy, a parliamentary democracy, not really a republic, because officially you have the head of state is a monarch, right? But in practical terms, you are sort of a republic in the sense that you have a representative democracy. So would you I guess it really sort of depends on how you're defining those terms. What would the average Canadian consider itself? A republic, parliamentary democracy, constitutional monarchy, all of the above?
Nor England would loan the government of Newfoundland a penny. Now keep in mind, both Canada and England were giving out loans to everyone around the world, bailing out almost every single country in the world. England was even giving money to Nazi Germany. But no loans were coming for Newfoundland. Instead, Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King signed a wave of tariffs against Newfoundland that made the problems worse. The British believed that it was all caused by mismanagement of Newfoundland government, nothing at all to do with the global recession. If you believe Newfoundland was sold to Canada, this is a good sign it might be true. 3 British ministers and 3 Newfoundland ministers met in a panel. The two sides agreed that the British would set up a commission that would run the country, and after it moved back into profitability, they would hand back over control of Newfoundland. This is really unprecedented in history of the world. England was bailing out all of their former colonies, but for whatever reason, Newfoundland was under their thumb. The Commission of Newfoundland saw the beginning of the rule of magistrates, who were off.
Is he right about that? And is that do any of you know why that is? Why Britain wasn't economically bailing out Newfoundland? And also, I think what he is saying here is that some people believe that Newfoundland was sold to Canada, and I'm sure he's going to explore that more. But is this a matter of controversy and disagreement among Canadians about, or Newfoundlanders specifically about how this all came about, and um, whether there are 2 points of view about what happened here or more?
Patronage positions from English lords. The island would remain under colonial control from 1934 until 1945. These magistrates would not spend a dollar on public infrastructure, but instead all tax revenues would be collected and placed in a central fund. This was rather unusual treatment for a colony. Most colonies were reinvested in for higher profits for the mother country, but in this case it was different. However, in 1939, a major world event would change Newfoundland's fortunes. World War II. That boy Hitler, who the English were giving loans, was using that money to take over Europe. And he wasn't even going to pay back the loans. The Newfoundland Regiment had been wiped out in World War I and was not present in World War II. Only those volunteers who chose to join the British forces would serve in World War II. In 1941, the British government signed.
So I did know that there was a separate Newfoundland regiment in the First World War. Or what they're saying here is that there wasn't an organized Newfoundland regiment. You just, if you were from Newfoundland, you just joined the British Army.
Leases with the United States to build air bases in Newfoundland. One will be built in Stephenville and another built in Gander. With the arrival of the Americans, money began pouring in, and friendly trade relations with the United States led to an increased demand for the province's plentiful fish. While the war was going on, the Commission of Newfoundland was posting giant surpluses every single year. America was seen as the saviors of Newfoundland, and this caused a bridge between traditional British and Newfoundland relations. With the war years being what they were, a need by the British to maintain overseas funds happened in case there was a need to supplement their war costs. A popular theory showing that Newfoundland was eventually manipulated into Confederation shows that the lump sum of money was held as an incentive to trade Newfoundland to another nation. Perhaps Canada, who owned a large segment of British war debt. Regardless, the money never did get transferred to Newfoundland and stayed in a British trust. When World War II ended and Newfoundland was now a highly profitable colony, the fate of the country had once again come into a question.
Before he moves on to that, that's interesting because you think about as part of geopolitics and our relationship with Britain, our being the United States relationship with Britain prior to Pearl Harbor, which was Roosevelt gradually trying to move the country towards accepting that we'd have to be in this war. and manipulating our neutrality laws to provide ultimately lend-lease. But before that, the destroyers for bases deal, which had this sort of unintended consequence on, and beneficial consequence, I suppose, on domestically what was going on in Newfoundland with a surge into the economy from all the Americans being there, in a wartime footing.
England no longer wished to simply give Newfoundland back to her people, but instead asked them to decide their fate via referendum. Referendum has an opportunity for vote manipulation. In the Quebec referendum, the Canadian government spent a disproportionately high amount of money on advertising to scare Quebec voters into a voting non. Where the fate of Newfoundland wasn't set in stone. The American bases in Newfoundland was literally a marriage of cultures. Thousands of young Newfoundland women had married American soldiers and American servicemen. There was now a sizable number of Newfoundlanders who were interested in becoming a united state. The thought of being surrounded by America was absolutely frightening to Canada. In the past, they had rejected Newfoundland's pleas for help, but now they were sitting at the table. Mackenzie King began trying to make a bid to have Newfoundland join Confederation with Canada. King had no interest in the province and felt he would be adopting Newfoundland's debt rather than picking up a precious property. But the idea that a U.S. state might control access to Canadian shipping routes was terrifying. Mackenzie King found an ally in Joseph R. Smallwood. Joseph Smallwood was born with a smooth tongue, able to convince anyone of anything. His command of the English language was superior to most Canadian politicians and judges. Mackenzie King decided to bankroll Smallwood's campaign for Confederation. On the table were the options to stay with England, become an independent country, join Confederation with Canada, or become a U.S. state. On the first ballot, England was the least popular vote and was removed from the next ballot. British lords met with Mackenzie King to make sure that Newfoundland would not become a U.S. state. The Great Conspiracy was now coming full circle, and there was a real incentive for Newfoundland to go to Canada.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm only taking what I'm hearing from this video, but it seems what they're saying is staying with Britain was eliminated right off the bat, and I guess that's just because of recent history, and there maybe seemed to be some disillusionment. There seemed to have been some interest in joining the United States just because of the ties that had formed by American service personnel being there, and the ties with the local community. They're suggesting that Canada did not want to have Newfoundland because of Newfoundland's debt, but, and I could completely understand this, it seems that it would not be advantageous for Canada for the United States to have obtained what is essentially the springboard across the North Atlantic to Europe, and that would put a large part of Canada's east coast in the hands of its neighbor to the south, and it seems very important for Canada to have access to both the Pacific and Atlantic coasts in a significant way.
The leading vote was to join the United States. Despite this, there wasn't any real interest in the United States to actually adopt Newfoundland. Not one U.S. penny was lobbied towards Newfoundland Confederation. America certainly would have accepted Newfoundland as another territory, but as a U.S. state, probably not. Joey Smallwood at this time began a tour of Newfoundland. Newfoundland had no roads across the country linking east to west. Smallwood went from community.
I wonder why that is, what his basis for saying that America would not have accepted Newfoundland as a state. Maybe not right away, but remember, Alaska and Hawaii were just territories of the United States for quite some time before they became states in the 1950s. So it probably would have been the case that it eventually would have been a state, if not right away.
To community via vote, convincing the locals to throw their vote behind Newfoundland. In many parts of the country, people weren't even aware there was a referendum going on, and Smallwood was charting remote communities that people weren't even aware existed. Simultaneously, the two separate movements were campaigning for independence for the colony. These two groups were based out of the colony's capital, St. John's, where over half of the recorded population lived. Peter Cashin and the Responsible Government League was the most popular and would spend a lot of time on the radio speaking directly to the people about conspiracy theories about these events. Cashin came from a long line of men of government who many accused of being in the pockets of the merchants. The merchants of Newfoundland were a cartel of price-fixing fish merchants. Newfoundlanders would place orders at their local merchant shop. Think of it as like a convenience store that imports what you need and exports what you sell. The price of what you would sell would always be set up so that there was always a tab to pay off the difference between buying and selling. Most Newfoundlanders didn't have a dollar to their name, and in the years that followed, they would blame the merchants. The second group was the Economic Union Party, led by Chesley Crosby. The Crosby family were a bit of royalty in Newfoundland. His father, John, was premier of the province. His son, John, was the most successful, having been a minister under both Liberal and PC premiers, as well as a minister in Joe Clark and Brian Mulrooney's federal governments. Smallwood was against some tough opposition. On the second ballot, independence had become the top vote, and, join the United States, had fallen to third place. The final vote would be between Newfoundland joining Confederation or remaining an independent government. In the end, Confederation had won. Joey Smallwood's well-oiled political machine had convinced 52% of Newfoundlanders to vote in favor of Confederation.
Was just going to ask that. 52%.
In the first general election, Joey Smallwood was ushered in as the first premier of the province. Smallwood ran unopposed for 23 straight years until eventually another party could gain enough support to replace him. He is the second longest-serving premier in Canadian history. His first action as premier was to kick all the merchants out of the province and pass laws outlawing price-fixing behaviors. In 1989, a new interprovincial ferry was given the name the Joseph and Clara Smallwood, in remembrance of the last surviving father of Confederation. Joey Smallwood led the province through a process of modernization. But that's a story for another time.
All right, my friends. That was interesting. So, my friends, I'm going to do another short video on this same topic right now, and I hope you stay tuned. The video is only almost 4 minutes, 3:50. It's from History Matters. It's cartoon. It's kind of entertaining. I like their material. But let's see if I can learn some things that I did not learn in the last video. All right, my friends, stay with me.
Only a recent addition to Canada, having joined it in 1949. Yet Canada was confederated in 1867, and so the two remained divided for nearly a century, which raises a pretty obvious question. Why? Why did it take so long for Newfoundland to join Canada? So, when the colonies which would become Canada were debating Confederation in 1864, politicians in Newfoundland began to discuss the issue at home. Did they want to be a part of this new Canada and take their rightful place in the world, or just sit on the sidelines and watch history pass them by? Turns out the sidelines were just fine, and Newfoundland would sit this Canada thing out. Their primary reasons were that 1, whilst the politicians there were largely pro-Confederation, the people were most certainly not. Which brings us on to reason number 2, Catholics. Specifically, French Catholics, who made up a sizable chunk of this new Canada's population and thus had a lot of influence. And the people of Newfoundland, proud Protestants that they were having none of that. And the third reason was economic.
Oh, that's interesting. So, the religious divide, and I suppose it's because Catholic French Canada, Quebec, was very close to Newfoundland, and religious rivalries have been a thing since the dawn of religion.
Newfoundland had low taxes, and there were concerns that a new central government in Ottawa would raise them to pay for things like railways and a national military. So what changed? Well, Newfoundland continued to develop on its own, and its people, for the most part, still wished to remain independent. There was a very sudden change of heart in 1895 when the Newfoundland Premier, William Whiteway, made a plea to join the Confederation. And this was totally because they loved Canada and nothing to do with the massive financial crisis that had just hit them. The Canadians said no, and so they were left to struggle on with mountains of debt. After this, the people of Newfoundland were still against Confederation, and in 1907 Newfoundland was promoted from a colony to a dominion, meaning that its continued independence seemed assured. And its history largely mirrored those of the other dominions throughout the early 20th century. There were reforms at home, political scandals, World War I, greater exploitation of natural resources, and a general improvement in the economic situation. That was at least until the Great Depression, which could only mean one thing: pain. Newfoundland was essentially bankrupted by this, and so it went for the previous tactic of trying to sell itself to Canada. The Canadians said no because it sounded expensive, and the British refused to help unless Newfoundland suspended its government and let them run it instead, which they did in 1934, and the British took over before proceeding to also be terrible at running the place. So in World War II, the British negotiated away basing rights to the United States in return for some much needed ships, and the Americans began massive investment in the area. This drastically improved the living standards of the people living there, and after the war many people demanded that British rule come to an end, which meant it was time for a referendum. The people had two choices: go back to being independent or remain under British control. The first option terrified the British because it would have meant Newfoundland increasing its ties with the United States, and there were some there even advocating for statehood. This option also terrified the Canadians because with these borders, Canada's access to the Atlantic could be restricted, and along with it, Britain's access to Canadian resources. And so, to stop this potential outcome from happening, the British and Canadians teamed up to add a third option to the ballot: join Canada. Now, the representatives of Newfoundland didn't want this option, but that's not how British rule worked, and so on the ballot it went. The referendum was held in 1948, and whichever option gained 50% of the vote, that would be the action taken. But none of them won, and so a second referendum, this time without the potential to continue British rule, was held, and union with Canada won with 52% of the vote. And after some negotiations, Newfoundland ceased to exist as a nation and became a part of Canada the next year. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for watching.
That did answer some questions that the other video didn't, as short and entertaining as it was. Certainly the religious thing, though, I think I understand that there are a lot of people of Irish descent in Newfoundland, at least now, because, unless they're from the Protestant north of Ireland, Scotch-Irish, I don't know. But, certainly the vast majority of Irish people from the Republic of Ireland are Catholic. So just kind of curious about that, since they said in this video that the majority of the people in Newfoundland were Protestant and were concerned about French Canadians being Catholic. In any case, it was very interesting. I enjoyed it. I know a lot more now. The first time the word Newfoundland came into my consciousness was I had a Labrador, and Labrador as well. I had a Labrador Retriever growing up as a kid. I was curious about how it was named, and I found by reading in my parents' World Book Encyclopedia that Labrador was this place in Canada, and there was a similar breed, a Newfoundland Retriever, and they were close together and part of this province, and so I was aware of the places from way back when, and also learning in elementary school that the first Europeans to set foot on North American soil were Vikings from Greenland. Leif Erikson, and specifically, is believed to have landed on Newfoundland, and I think there are the ruins of a small settlement there that it is believed, although not, I think, conclusively determined, that was one of Leif Erikson's short-lived settlements. But that was 500 years before Columbus set foot on the island of Hispaniola. So Canada definitely has that unique piece of world history. All right, my friends, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you soon. Peace.